Hello and welcome. I am so happy that you have joined me today. We will be continuing in our study of the book of Judges, and we'll be looking at Judges chapter 19 today. So get yourself a strong cuppa and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I look forward to reading some of your comments. So a very, very strong, I can't overemphasize this enough. A very strong trigger warning for today. This study will contain references to vicious sexual abuse, gang rape, dismemberment of a corpse. So if these are any trigger points for you, please feel the freedom to just skip this video and I'll see you in the next one. So this chapter would have to be the most horrifying chapter in the whole of the Bible. The final 3 chapters of the book of Judges tells us some of the most disturbing stories in the whole of the Bible. The story begins in Judges chapter 19 here today and is a harsh reminder of humanity's capacity for evil when we stray from God's perfect law. While there is an uncomfortable chapter, it prompts reflection on personal and social morality and underscores the urgent need for spiritual compass to navigate the complexities of life. This is a very uncomfortable chapter, and it is tempting just to rush through it quickly and avoid the sense of unease. But it is worth our while to sit in the discomfort so that we can learn the richness of God's sovereign plan for his people. We can learn a lot from this chapter to apply to our own lives. So verse 1, in those days Israel had no king, and now a Levite who lived in the remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judea. So right at the beginning, we can see in those days, Israel had no king. And it tends to be a common phrase through the book of Judges. Other phrases add, in those days, Israel had no king, and in those days, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. But Israel did have a king. They had King God. But among other things, when God's people rebel against him, the people did what was right in their own eyes, as we see this all through the book of Judges. There is disunity. We see this in the next chapter with the civil war with the Benjaminites and the rest of the tribes of Israel. We see the weak are abused when people don't follow God and do things that are right in their own eyes. We see this in this chapter. We see this in the last chapter. And we see evil and unwise things considered as good and wise. So our moral compass turns upside down when we don't follow God. In the first verse, we are introduced to our first character, the Levite, in the land of Ephraim. The Levite is not to be confused with the Levite from the previous 2 chapters. It's 2 totally different men. Then immediately after, we are introduced to another character. We're introduced to his concubine. So what's the purpose of a concubine? In the Bible, a concubine was a woman acquired by a man as a secondary wife. Her purpose was to provide a male heir in case the first wife was barren. She could provide more children to generally enhance the wealth of the family or the workforce in the family, and also to satisfy the men's sexual desire. In the Bible, a concubine is a woman who lives with a man as if she were a wife, but without having the same status as a wife. Concubines in Israel possessed most of the same rights as legitimate wives, but without the same respect. The Bible consistently promotes monogamy. However, the Bible never really explains why God allowed men to have concubines. He allowed divorce and he allowed polygamy too, although neither was part of God's original plan for marriage. Jesus said God had allowed divorce because of the hardness of men's hearts, so possibly it was the hardness of men's heart that led to polygamy and concubinage. Verse 2, but she was unfaithful to him. So the concubine was unfaithful to the Levite. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem in Judea. After she had been there for 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and his 2 donkeys. He took them to the parents' house, to her parents' house, and her father-in-law saw him and he gladly welcomed him. So this unnamed Levite takes his concubine from Bethlehem to be his wife. She's unfaithful to him, she leaves him, and she returns to her father's house. And then the Levite goes after her to get her back. The Levite attempted to bring her back, and it says in verse 3 that he spoke kindly to her, presumably in an effort to woo her back with his charming and persuasive and eloquent words. The Levite's father-in-law then encourages the Levite to stay. And stay he did for another couple of days, and this is very typical Jewish hospitality. Verse 4, the father-in-law and the woman's father prevailed upon him to stay, so he returned with them for 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. On the 4th day they get up to go, and he prepared to leave, but the woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh yourself with something and eat, then you may go. So the two of them sat down to eat and drink together, and after the woman's father said, oh, please stay tonight and enjoy yourself. When the men got up to go, the father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there another night. So the Levite appears to be a nice guy. He's wooing back his unfaithful concubine. He's being respectful and honouring and friendly to his father-in-law. Verse 8, on the morning of the 5th day, when he rose to go, the woman's father said, oh, refresh yourself, wait till the afternoon. So the two men ate together. And then when the man and his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the woman's father, said, oh, now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. And the day is almost over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home. So on the 5th day, after staying at his father's house much longer than he had expected, the Levite finally leaves with her. However, there's not much time left in the day, so they're unable to travel as far as they wanted to until evening sets in and it's too dark to travel. Verse 10, but unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. And when they were near Jebus, the day was almost done, and the servant said to his master, oh, come, let's stop here in the city of the Jebusites and spend the night. His master, which is the Levite, he replied, no, we won't go into that city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah. And he added, come, let's try and reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places. So the Israelite, or the Levite, he assumes that he'll be safer in an Israelite town compared to this non-Israelite town called Jebus. Instead of staying in a town of foreigners, the Levite opts for a town a little bit further on to be with his own people. Instead of being met with hospitality, no one takes them in for the night. The Israelites were supposed to take care of travellers, especially those who were Israelites. And so their lack of hospitality hints that the people of Gibeah are not following God's law. And we'll see later on that the Israelites living in Gibeah were pretty much as bad as the Canaanites. So Jebus, which wasn't an Israelite town at the time, Jebus was the name of Jerusalem before it was conquered by King David, and it became the city of Israel then. But at this time, the Jebusites, which was a Canaanite tribe, they were inhabiting Jebus, also known as Jerusalem. The city's name was changed to Jerusalem after David's conquest about 100 years later. Verse 14, so they went on, and the sun set, and they neared Gibeah in Benjamin, and they stopped to spend the night. And they went and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. So they tried to spend the night in Gibeah, but initially they faced a problem. No one in Gibeah had offered them hospitality, and they were left sitting in the city square. In ancient Israel, hospitality was a fundamental cultural expectation and a moral obligation. It was so deeply rooted in their nomadic past and their desert environment. And so it was a sacred duty to welcome strangers and travellers and those in need, providing them with food, shelter and protection. And biblical law specifically emphasised the welcome of strangers, reminding them that they were once strangers in a foreign land. And this custom extended beyond just mere politeness. It was becoming an integral part of their social and religious life. So the fact that this Israelite town, Gibeah, was not hospitable, it just really reveals the customs of that time. They had become more like the Canaanites than the Israelites. Verse 16, that evening, an old man from the hill country in Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the places were Benjaminites, came in from the work from the fields. And he looked and he saw the travellers at the city square. And the old man said, where are you going? Where do you come from? So now we meet another character, this old man who lived in Gibeah, maybe a farmer. He asks where they're from and he asks where they're going. Verse 18, so he, the Levite, he answered, "We're on our way to Bethlehem in Judea, to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, where I live. I have been in Bethlehem in Judea, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys. We have bread and wine for ourselves and our servants, and me and the woman and the young man with us. We don't need anything." So the Levite states that they would not be a burden on the host because they have everything that they need. They have enough food and supplies for themselves and for their donkeys. All they really need is just a place to sleep for the night. Verse 20, "You're welcome to stay at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply you whatever you need, only don't spend the night in this square." So he took him to the house and he fed the donkeys, and after he had washed his feet, which is a very Jewish thing to do, they had something to eat and drink. So the old man, he offered the Levite and the group lodging in his house, and he probably promised to take care of all their needs, ensuring that they shouldn't stay in the public square. Then he brought them into their house, he provided food for the donkeys, and he offered them food and drink, and he washed their feet. Verse 22, "And so while they were there enjoying themselves, some wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, 'Bring out the men who have come into your house so that we may have sex with them.'" So the original Hebrew here uses the term that "we may know him." And this is a similar term that was once used in Genesis 24 when Isaac knew Rebekah. So that's Genesis 16:24 verses 67. "Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah, so they became his wife. He loved her, and Isaac comforted her in her death." So that's from the NIV, but other versions will say like he knew her. So we know where this is headed. The wicked and perverted men of Gibeah, they demand that the host be handed over, and so that the Levite hand over the Levite rather, so that they could have homosexual relations with him. And they reveal that Gibeah is extremely wicked. This is an Israelite town, to the point of being comparable to Sodom. Now, that's where the term sodomy comes from. So let's just do a little bit of a sidetrack into homosexuality. The Bible clearly and consistently declares that homosexuality activity is a sin. We can see that in Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, Timothy 1. God created marriage and sexual relationships to be between one man and one woman. At the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one in flesh." That's from Matthew 19. Anything outside of God's intent is sin. And the Bible teaches us that Christians are to live for God, deny themselves, pick up their cross, and follow him. We see that in Matthew 16, including our sexual nature and our sexual desires. This disconnect between what the Bible says and what some people feel leads to much controversy, much debate, and sometimes even hostility within the church. Since the nature of sin has affected all aspects of God's perfect creation, a person may have greater susceptibility to homosexuality, just as some people have greater tendencies to any other sin. But that does not exclude that person from choosing to sin and giving into excuse that person by choosing that sin and giving into those sexual desires. Just because a person has a greater susceptibility to fits of rage, for example, doesn't mean that they have the right to give into those desires and explode at every provocation. And the same truth with susceptibility to homosexuality. When examining what the Bible says about homosexuality, it is important to distinguish between homosexual behaviour and homosexual inclinations or attractions or temptations. It is the difference between active sin and just a passive condition of being tempted. Homosexual behaviour is a sin, but the Bible never says that being tempted is a sin. After all, we know that Jesus was tempted himself but never sinned. Simply stated, the struggle with temptation may lead to sin, but the struggle itself is not a sin. Verse 23, the owner of the house went outside and said to them, this is this mob that is pounding on the door wanting to know the Levite. No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can do with them whatever you wish. But as for this man, do not do such an outrageous thing. So to describe this sin, the owner of the house calls this sin, he calls it vile, he calls it outrageous. The Hebrew word here is to encompass vileness and selfishness in a disgraceful volley. It says it's immoral, it's profane, it's lewd, it's a disgrace. But then he offers his virgin daughter, and the Levite's concubine so that they can use them to do whatever they wish. And is this not as vile and as outrageous as the men wanting the Levite? Maybe even more so, because the women were vulnerable. They were more vulnerable than men in ancient culture. They were considered as property. But even as property, they should have been valued, respected, and protected. Verse 25, the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her through the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell on the floor, and lay there until daylight. So the Levite gave his concubine to these wicked men, despite this initially speaking so kindly to her and wooing her back just hours before. He exploited her to save himself, taking advantage of the situation. But as a Levite, he should have addressed this behaviour of the men of Gibeah. But instead, he neglected his responsibility as a Levite and as a husband, and he threw his concubine to the dogs. For this poor concubine was raped and abused all night by a horde of perverted men. And we are immediately repulsed. And the inclusion of this story in Judges is intended to be confronting. And if you're not unsettled by this or repulsed by this, something is wrong with you. It is tempting just to skip past this part and move on. But there is a benefit in dwelling in this comfort and appreciating the horror of this situation, as it is a reflection on how Israelite is at this time and how humanity can be when we reject God as our king. She was raped brutally. These men were frustrated because they didn't get what they wanted. They didn't get the Levite, and now they are going to take their frustration out on this poor girl. She would have been black and blue all over. She would have been deeply grazed all over her body. She may have suffered concussion from the physical assault, blacked out and woken up with a completely different man on top of her. She may have had broken bones, dislocated joints. She may have been torn and hemorrhaging. She would have been in excruciating pain from the constant forced penetration of being raped all night. I do not have the words to fully describe how horrible this was for her, and I find this extremely unsettling. Had she lived, she would have developed and constantly suffered from imaginable psychological injuries from this trauma. And as horrible as this story is, this is not the first time a story like this has happened in the Bible. The people of Gibeah's actions harken back to a story in Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. Sodom was the ultimate example of wickedness of a city in the Old Testament times. And its situation is in Genesis 19. It's almost identical to what happened here in Judges 19. So note the similarities. I'm going to read the passage. Just note to yourself how similar these two passages are. Genesis 19 verses 1 to 3. 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gateway of the city, and when he saw them, he got up to meet them, bowed down with his face to the ground. Lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and go on your way early the next morning. No, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But he insisted strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and he ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men of every part of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, where are the men that came with you tonight? Bring them out so that we can get to know them as well. Lot went inside the house to meet them, and he shut the door behind them and said, no, my friends, do not do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them what you like. But don't do this thing to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Get out of my way, they replied. The fellow here came as a foreigner, and now he wants to play judge. We will treat you worse than him. They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside, they reached out and they pulled Lot back into the house, and they shut the door. And the men, they were struck, and he struck the men who were at the door of the house, both young and old, with blindness, and they could not find the door. So you can see a lot of similarities between this story and the other one, but I do feel as if this one's a lot more horrific for the concubine that was involved. Verse 27, when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen on the doorway of the house, her hands on the threshold. He said, get up, let's go. But there was no answer. The man put her on the donkey and set her out to go home. So the Levite arose the next morning. He walks out of the house to find his concubine. And just notice the tone of the Levite. Get up, let's go. Where did this chivalrous, sweet-talking Levite go? There was no sense of compassion. There's no sense of loving kindness for the concubine who saved his skin. He sacrificed her for his own self-preservation. And all he has to say to her is, get up, let's go. Did he not hear her screams of agony all night and her cries for help? How could he have slept all night hearing the jeers and the grunts of those perverted men? I have lost all respect for this Levite now, but it only gets worse. Verse 29, when he reached home, he took a knife and he cut up this concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them to all the areas of Israel. So receiving a portion of a young woman's body being unburied was the height of contamination and uncleanliness to the Jews. Jews were considered unclean if they had touched a body, and so it shows the horror and the terror of this situation. But really, this was too little too late. The Levite, he should have spoken up much, much earlier. He should have spoken up immediately when those wicked men of Gibeah were pounding on the door of that old man's house. Sometimes we can get outraged by wickedness when it affects us, but we take way too long to speak up against it. We need to raise our voices against that which is wickedness as soon as we're aware of it. We need to take a stand for righteousness in our time. There's a well-known quote from a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and it relates to the silence of action. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. To not to act is to act. So what we see here in this verse, those who received these packages and understood the significance of this message, they considered it, they conferred, and they spoke up. So they considered it. They gave their mind to consider the weight of this issue and its implications, and they made the uncomfortable choice of giving it serious thought and attention to this matter. And it would have been emotionally a lot easier just to ignore it, but they chose to consider. They conferred, so they understood that this required careful deliberation because of its serious consequences and implications. They gave their time to seriously discuss it with other leaders. Thirdly, they spoke up. They took on the responsibility to declare what is right and what is ungodly. And it's a spiritual principle that we can learn from this horrifying chapter, that we need to speak up against evil in our society and do it courageously. But we always need to wrap it in the love of Jesus. And I think how easily it is for us to point the finger at victims of abuse when they can't get their life together because they're so traumatized by their abuse. They're on drugs or they've turned to other vices. They can't get a job. They mismanage their government benefits. They never complete their schooling, or they're neglectful parents themselves and pass on that same abuse to their children. But where did the church step in and to protect these people from their original abuse? Where did the church speak up against this abuse so that they didn't have to suffer and then go on to lead a life that reflected that abuse? The church needs to speak up. We need to confer. We need to take that time to consider and have the courage to speak up. Jesus said to those who don't protect the vulnerable, he said, if anyone causes one of these little ones to sin who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. We need to courageously consider, confer, and speak up against the moral decline that we see in our society and against these weaknesses in our community, this wickedness that we see creeping in. But be led by the wisdom of the Spirit and wrap your messages in the love of Christ. That's all I have today for you from Judges chapter 19. Thank you for sticking with me. It was not easy. I usually say that it has been a pleasure spending time with you, but honestly, this has been rough. But I will see you next time when we study Judges chapter 20. It's still going to be difficult, but come and join me then. We'll see you next time. Bye.